Thank you so much, Pat, for that lovely introduction. I always feel like when people read my whole bio that I kind of want to like shrink into the background. But yeah, it is so lovely to be with you here today. I also want to pick up on something that someone's commented on in the chat, which is just the congratulations for all of us adapting to this new technology. It's certainly been a big change and learning curve for all of us. So really amazing to be with you all on Zoom today. And I think the silver lining perhaps of having to meet in this way is that we're able to come together from all across the country fairly easily without huge expenditures or carbon emissions. So yeah, so let's just celebrate the fact that we're all kind of figuring out how to get together despite the odds and learning new ways to cultivate community. So yeah, it's such a pleasure to be with Gran today. We were really excited at Climate Action Network Canada when Gran applied for membership. It's particularly thrilling for us to have such a diversity of organizations across the country who care about how a changing climate is affecting people, places, and wildlife. And we know that Gran's focus on mobilizing women in particular who are people who tend to care more about the climate crisis, and older women who have, women of a certain age who have, a tremendous amount of experience and insight to offer, and also who have a certain amount of, maybe I'll say moral authority in their communities is absolutely essential. And I'm going to talk a little bit about why I feel that's so important later on in my presentation. On a personal note, I just want to share, first of all, today I'm calling in from unceded Algonquin and Anishinaabe territories in Ottawa. It's really important for me to acknowledge the traditional territories that I live and work on. I also want to share with you that my grandmother was one of the primary people who raised me and is really the most important person in my life, and as someone who's given me tremendous guidance over the course of my life. So being able to connect with other grandmothers who are actively advocating for progressive change in their communities means the world to me. And I only wish my grandmother could join us today. A quick tidbit for those of you who might be calling in on the phone, a way that you can mute yourself just to make sure that the quality of my sound is coming through really clearly for you is to hit *6 on your keypad. And that will both mute your phone and unmute your phone so that you're sure to hear us all really clearly. And with that, I am going to get my presentation started. Alrighty. Can you all see this okay? I'm going to take silence as a yes. I'm sure someone will step in and give me feedback if the picture gets wonky or if my sound changes at all. So I'm going to begin by telling you a little bit about Climate Action Network Canada and how we work. And who we work with, what our kind of theory of change is. I'm then going to talk a little bit about my reflections on the climate movement at this point in time. And in particular, I really want to share with you some exciting work we're doing to advocate for a just recovery as we continue to respond to and eventually emerge from the COVID-19 emergency. Here are my credentials. So this is my email address. Climate Action Network Canada is the organization that I work with. And for those of you who are on Twitter, you can find me. Oh, I have to update that. My handle has been updated to @Abreu_. So the underscore just comes after my last name. Climate Action Network Canada is an umbrella organization that has, at this point, about 120 members, so update on this slide as well. And our membership are organizations who work coast to coast to coast in Canada. We are the Canadian node of Climate Action Network International, so we have colleagues who run similar umbrella organizations in the United States, so there's Climate Action Network United States, Europe, for instance. But CAN Canada is special, and the reason we're special is because our membership is the most diverse of other CAN memberships. Whereas other CAN networks tend to bring together primarily environmental groups. We at CAN Canada pull in labor unions, Indigenous and First Nations organizations, health groups, youth groups, international development, and humanitarian groups. And that diversity really gives us the space to have such rich conversations and to foster those cross-sectoral campaigns that we think are really essential to make lasting change. The three pillars of our work, as I describe it, is number one, we want to make sure that Canada embarks on courageous economic restructuring based on the principles of a just transition and linked to mid-century decarbonization. So we see the project to address climate change in Canada as one that requires a kind of full-scale societal transformation so that we are building our communities and our workforces around the central principles of justice and providing a clean, livable planet for all. Number two, we really work at the intersection of the domestic and the international. So wherever Canada's climate commitments kind of meet up with the international climate regime, we're there. That's really a big niche for us. So we advise the Canadian government on pulling together delegations of Canadian civil society to international climate events, for instance. And Canada has a kind of dual role when it comes to climate change. We have the work that we have to do at home, and we have the role that we have to play on the international stage, standing up for climate action and making sure that climate action continues to drive forward globally. So we want to see consistency in both of those spheres. We often find that this government at least talks a really good talk internationally about climate action and is willing to expend political capital in climate action internationally, and that's actually really important. But it's undermined when the domestic action here at home doesn't actually walk the talk, right? So we want to be sure that the action that Canada is taking at the domestic scale matches up with that really good talk that we're talking on the international scale. And I know this is an important one for Gran because a lot of your focus is outside of Canadian borders as well. And then finally, we want to see that international rhetoric, that ongoing prioritization of climate action by the Canadian government in the international sphere. There are kind of three anchors to our work, as I describe it. Number one is nurturing and providing services to our network of members. So we have in our membership organizations that are really, really focused on climate change, and that's what they wake up to do every day. And we have organizations in our membership who are really, really focused on making sure workplace health and safety is reflected across the various affiliates that they work with as a national union. And so those organizations have different needs in terms of what an umbrella organization like ours can provide. So we endeavor to make sure those climate organizations that are really focused on making climate action a reality are networking amongst themselves. We figure out how to do joint advocacy. We try to build connections between organizations in different parts of the country. And we also act as a kind of informational service to those members who are doing really important good work, mostly focused in other areas. So, you know, if Oxfam Canada needs to know what to say on a particular climate policy, we're there to give them the Coles notes on what that climate policy means, or what this climate event that's coming up, how that's relevant to them in their work. We also have a whole series of phone calls and email listservs that work to connect our membership. And traditionally, we host an in-person convening of Canada's climate community called ClimateCon. It's a superhero-themed conference once a year, but we, of course, are not having ClimateCon this year for obvious reasons. So hopefully we'll get to return to that in 2021 and Gran can participate. Really, the second pillar of our work is around domestic climate policy. On this front, we can be a bit wonky, so we get in there figuring out how to advise the Canadian government on how to actually develop and stick to its climate commitments. We do this hand in hand with our membership. So we figure out spaces where there's perhaps a gap in advocacy that our members aren't already doing, and we'll take a lead on that. Otherwise, we're really happy to take our members' leads in the places where they're already really engaged on policy development. one of our key campaigns right now is around Canadian climate accountability. I'm in fact doing a media briefing tomorrow on a paper we released recently that outlines legislation we are demanding to see in place that will keep Canada on track to finally meet a climate commitment. We've been setting climate targets since the early 90s and we've never met a single one. So we feel it's time to break our cycle of making empty promises, and we've laid out a series of legislative and institutional changes that we think Canada needs to make in order to ensure that we never miss another climate target. We'll be doing a webinar on that actually next week on June 17th, so I'll be sure to circulate the invite to that in case any of you on the line are interested in Canadian climate accountability. And then finally, as I said, we work very much at the international sphere. So I already let you know, we advise the Canadian government on how they interact when it comes to international climate politics, what we expect them to be bringing to the table. We pull together delegations of Canadian civil society to go to climate and clean energy events abroad. And an example of that is many of you may have heard of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change's, the IPCC's groundbreaking report in 2018 of global warming of 1.5 degrees. And I was actually the head of international civil society at that meeting. So we get to play this kind of exciting dual role of driving climate ambition forward internationally as well as grounding it here at home domestically. I'm going to give you a couple of examples of how we work in partnership with our membership and some recent wins that we've had. And then I'm going to move into talking about the kind of climate movement writ large and sharing some reflections with you. So we really focused on just transition for many years. For us, a just transition is absolutely an essential piece of the puzzle when it comes to climate action in Canada. And for us, that means a just transition in workplaces and communities in line with a phase out of dependence on fossil fuels over time. A couple of years ago, we joined hands with our labor members and we said, okay, we're gonna make sure just transition is the priority of the Canadian government toward the end of 2017. And we're going to make sure that the Canadian government launches a task force on just transition to think through the workforce implications of what was then the Pan-Canadian Framework's planned accelerated phase out of coal-fired electricity. And how we did this was by going to the UN climate negotiations with many of our members and using that international platform to draw a whole lot of attention to the Canadian situation of accelerated phase out of coal-fired electricity and the need to be implementing some just transition tactics in order to ensure workers and communities were protected in that transition. And we were really thinking constructively about where those communities and workforces were going to find their prosperity moving forward. So at COP, we did a ton of media. We hosted an international press conference. We got a lot of pickup, both in English and other language media. And all that pressure built up to get the then Minister of Environment and Climate Change to announce a task force on just transition for Canadian coal power workers and communities. This was one of the first task force of its kind in the world. It was really precedent setting. It was huge news, not just here at home, but across the globe. Proud to say that it was co-chaired by Climate Action Over Canada members, the Canadian Labour Congress and the Conservation Council of New Brunswick, along with a number of other members. That task force undertook its work over the course of about 18 months. And over the course of those 18 months, we had this incredible upswelling in our individual member organizations, bringing that conversation really home. So in Saskatchewan, in Alberta, in New Brunswick, in Nova Scotia, we had members bringing together that diverse community of environmental and labor organizations, of folks thinking through community transformation and trying to actually ask at that very local level what we want our future to look like. And so much rich material came out of those campaigns, and it was really amazing to have this bird's eye view on all of the local work going on to support a just transition. all of that adds up into this huge drumbeat across the country for the federal government to take just transition more seriously. And indeed, in the 2019 election in September, this appears. We find that the Liberals promise a Just Transition Act in their new mandate. So that was also a really exciting commitment. And while we're not solely responsible for it, I think we in our membership can take some credit in bringing that a really important issue to light. So a really good example of how we've all worked together, making use of both the domestic and international spheres, and this amazing cross collaboration at the local, provincial, and federal level in Canada. We see a really similar dynamic on fossil fuel subsidies. And the reason I include this is because I find fossil fuel subsidies is one of the most intuitive issues that folks thinking through climate change and how changes need to be made to our economic and social systems in response to the climate crisis. It's one of the most intuitive things that people can grab onto really easily. So Canada is a recent report shows that Canada is the second highest financer of fossil fuels in the G20. So that means Canada is the second highest, uses public funds to the second highest degree in all of the G20 to finance fossil fuels. We're just after Japan in that calculation. And so we have for many years been hand in hand with our membership working on a campaign to make sure Canada stops funding the problem and starts directing those funds to the solution. And this is a campaign that many of our members are involved in. So while we, as the Climate Action Network Canada Secretariat, design certain policy asks and then feed that out to our network, it's our members who pick those policy asks up and make them meaningful to people. So we have Kairos and other faith-based groups who have made an end to fossil fuel subsidies the key to their campaign to all of their faith-based members. And those kinds of campaigns have resulted in tens of thousands of letters being sent to decision makers in Canada calling for an end to fossil fuel subsidies. So just a little bit of insight into what Climate Action Network Canada is and how we work, and perhaps a little bit of inspiration for how GRAN can fit into the overall work of our network. And we are always looking for great ideas to come from our membership. So always want to hear from you on things that we should be doing. So here we are. It's 2020. Everything is different. Even this conversation that I'm about to have with you about the global climate movement has shifted significantly in recent months in ways that I don't even know I'm equipped to talk about. That being said, it's really clear to me that we have entered into a new era of climate activism. Greta Thunberg, amazing 16-year-old Swedish woman who, is one of the faces of this new era of climate activism. And here she is speaking to the UN in New York in September 2019. And we have, leaders of the world responding to her. We have Donald Trump making inappropriate comments about her. We have the UN Secretary General in the bottom right-hand corner, Antonio Guterres, inviting Greta Thunberg to speak to UN General Assemblies. We have this group in the top right-hand corner of oil and gas executives feeling pressured to get into a room and spin some stories about how they're going to respond to Greta's demands. I think that Greta is an incredibly inspiring spokesperson who has really galvanized a lot of passion for the issue of climate activism in the last couple of years. But from my perspective, this isn't all about one very charismatic and talented young leader. From my perspective, Greta really opened a door that a lot of people were longing to walk through. So she came along at the right moment where, from my perspective, millions of people around the world were feeling concerned about climate change, were wanting to understand what they could do about it. And she opened a window that invited people into that space. So while I give her a lot of credit for being the talented young and brilliant young woman that she is, I think pinning the current reality of the climate movement that we're seeing all on Greta is inaccurate, because we have really been seeing this growth in concern over climate change for quite a long time. So here we are, images of climate strikes that I was really fortunate to be at through 2018 and 2019. We have the main picture, late September 2019, Montreal, millions of people on the street, like assault. It was incredible. It was, 250,000 people out in the streets of Montreal, or actually closer to 500,000. And when I was on those streets in Montreal, I was reflecting on the last largest climate mobilization that I had been in Quebec in 2015, and there were 25,000 people there, and we thought it was an incredible win. So in the span of 4 years, to see the exponential growth in the amount of people who were willing to come out into the streets to demand climate action was so overwhelmingly moving. And what was particularly moving to me was to really see the diversity of people on the streets and the diversity of demands that they were bringing to the table. So we've also seen this rising up in direct action protests, and this is, I think, most clearly captured by groups like Extinction Rebellion. So groups that are using these direct action tactics to make the call for climate action and a livable planet unignorable. But we also see that those communities, those folks who are on the front lines of climate impacts, as well as climate leadership, who have been driving the climate movement for so long, Indigenous people, people of color, folks living in frontline communities, have really been at the forefront of the climate community for many years and teaching us so many lessons. And we are starting to see that their efforts are being amplified, their call to action is being taken up. And with it, we are seeing this kind of inextricable linking of climate issues with social issues. And that's what brings us to the concept of climate justice, that in fact, the climate crisis is the result of structural inequities, in the same way that forms of discrimination like racism are the result of structural inequities. And so we must figure out how to fight those both battles at once, address those structural issues that are at the heart of climate action and other injustices, and make sure that as we fight for climate action, we are also fighting for solutions that will improve people's lives, that will answer these calls for justice that are being made. We've seen this. These are some polling numbers from the election era in Canada. Climate change was really at the top of people's minds throughout the fall. We saw consistently that climate change was really at the top of the agenda in terms of what people were thinking about when they were considering their votes. And indeed, we saw in the end that over 60%, in fact, 62% of those who voted in the Canadian election in 2019 cast their ballots for parties that promised to do more on climate change. And so this level of concern showed up in the votes. And from my perspective, I was really involved in the election time, doing tons of media, speaking to parties, trying to host debates. Climate was consistently the policy issue that rose through the fray of what was otherwise an election characterized by name calling and mudslinging. Climate, again and again, was the policy issue that rose through all that noise. And so I call the 2019 election Canada's first climate election. And so I really take hope from the fact that that concern over climate change, awareness over climate change, was at an all-time high toward the end of 2019. The reality is, and this has only increased in recent months, that anxieties over the state of the world is also really present right now. So While the majority of Canadians in this poll think that Canada's on the right track, more or less, most Canadians think that the world is going in the wrong direction. And that's a really scary place to be. This is a poll that's done once a year by a global firm that kind of tracks general levels of trust, of faith in populations. And we can see that in the 2019, this came out in late 2019 poll, Canadians significantly decreased in their belief that they will be better off in 5 years. So there's a lot of uncertainty in the air. And no wonder we're kind of in this post-truth era where a lot of people are trying to understand where the right place to get their information is from, particularly now during the pandemic era. The vulnerabilities built into our societies and our economies are more apparent than ever. And people are trying to figure out who to trust as they work to address those vulnerabilities, as they demand justice, as they demand compensation and safety. So in this context, who do people trust? And this gets me to a comment that I made earlier on when I was saying hello to all of you. Because from a climate activist perspective, I spend a lot of my time asking myself, who is going to trust what I have to say about climate change? Because ultimately, people don't act unless they are confident that their action is going to make a difference, and they are convinced that their actions make a difference by people they trust. How do we talk and think about climate change? Well, for many years, we were like all about the science of climate change, right? So we have the IPCC, we have scientists, we have global consensus. And I think activists like me, for a lot of our careers, have tended to get trapped in the just tell them the science and they'll do the right thing trap. And the reality is that, facts is not what compels people's actions. So while having the science is absolutely essential because we want decision makers to be making their decisions based on the best available science, it's not the thing that's going to compel people to get on board with climate action, to demand that their politicians are taking the level of action that science describes. So then we thought, okay, well, if science isn't the thing that's going to make people believe they need to take action on climate change, it's going to compel governments to change their ways, maybe we can talk about the economy. And so we got really good about thinking through a low carbon economy, describing the tremendous opportunities that exist in a growing lower carbon clean economy. And indeed, the clean economy sector, the clean economy is now a multi-trillion-dollar economy worldwide. And unfortunately, Canada has fairly consistently lost out on that economy over the years. And that's something we as a country really need to work at. We also got really good at talking about the financial risks in inaction. So saying, hey, like, the amount of catastrophic losses that Canada is facing is huge. We need to be thinking about climate change as a risk to your overall portfolios. But even though we got really good at talking about the economy, that still wasn't really enough for us to make people's minds change. So do we talk about people? This is kind of the question from my perspective. And I think over the last few years, the climate movement has gotten a lot better at talking about people, speaking about the ways in which people's lives, in which their communities are impacted by the climate crisis, but also speaking about the ways in which we have a collective responsibility to take care of ourselves and each other. And this ultimately is why I say I think there were millions of people who were kind of waiting for an invitation to get more involved in climate action, and that Greta helped to open that door for them. Because I think over the last few years, people have been really feeling climate change as something that's personal to them. And here's just a quick example. So really, in the last few months of 2019, this poll went out across the country, and then I got asked about it a million times in news interviews. And the poll asks, how much are you willing to pay to address climate change? And it's not a very promising result. So we see that almost 50% of people who responded to this poll weren't willing to pay a penny. to address climate change. And then only 22% were willing to pay between $0 and $100 a year to help address climate change. And I think this poll got trotted out as evidence that people don't care about the issue, or that they care about it, but they're not really willing to put their money where their mouth is. But the problem with this question is that it takes a collective crisis and it makes it an individual problem. So it says, how much money are you personally willing to put on your credit card to address this issue? And for me, this is the result. This is yet another iteration of a decades-long campaign that we've seen from those companies and those governments who profit from the status quo, trying to make climate change an individual problem. Because what happens when you make it an individual problem? Well, it looks impossible to address. And so people feel hopeless and they disengage. In reality, climate change is a collective problem. So from my perspective, the right way to phrase this question is not how much are you willing to pay? It's how much do you expect your government on your behalf to take your tax dollars and invest them in the solution? And I think if the question had been phrased in that way, we'd get some pretty different responses. And this leads me to my final point in my presentation before I talk to you about what we're working on right now. And this is that we've gotten good at talking about the science of climate change. We've got good at talking about the economy. And finally, we've gotten a bit better at talking about what it means for people and personalizing the issue. But now we're in an era where really we need to be talking about it from a community perspective. Because when I take a look around the world and I watch people responding to the incredible worsening impacts of the climate crisis, thinking through how to develop creative means to keep their communities alive, to make sure that their communities have access to the fresh water, the clean water, the food, and the basics of everyday life that they need to thrive. When I see people fighting against horrific impacts and trying to protect the homes that people live in, trying to make sure that there isn't, trying to combat the incredible crisis in migration that we're seeing as a result of climate impacts. When I see those millions and millions of people in the streets, in particular young people, getting out to raise their voice for climate action. And when I see people bringing their children into this fight, and when I see groups like yours of grandmothers getting into this fight, what I see is people using the fight for climate action as a way to build connections with each other and with their communities, as a way to actually build community through action. And that's, from my perspective, what we need to fight climate change. Because in my opinion, and I wrote this up a number of years ago, working on climate change is really an act of love. At this point in human history, taking care of the people we love requires us to take care of the planet and requires us to take action on climate change. And this is what we're seeing in proposals like the Green New Deal, proposals that try to put humans, people, communities at the heart of the solution, that try to bring together environmental and social benefits in policy proposals. And that's why I think so many young people are so galvanized by the idea of a Green New Deal, because they see this as a way for us to invest in ourselves, invest in our communities, and really act from a place of love. I always want to include this funny cartoon in my presentations, and because I think it really brings it all down to what I've been talking about. And this is that, a lot of folks who push back against climate action, you do that because they question the severity of the problem. But in reality, most climate solutions are also solutions that are going to be building a better world. And so even if climate change is a hoax, we will have built a better world in responding to it. And I think that's one of the huge messages that we want to take away. And because this is a place that we come at it from in this moment of global and Canadian crisis, we at Climate Action Network Canada have prioritized a conversation about a just recovery. So from my perspective, as I think maybe I've said, the twin crises of a global pandemic and the crash in global oil prices have revealed to us the vulnerabilities built into our economic and social systems. So we have inequality in wealth, access to essential services, racial and other forms of discrimination, colonial forms of extraction that really bleed cultural and resources dry. And those vulnerabilities have come home to roost. And what we've been seeing in the United States and across Canada in recent weeks tells us that those vulnerabilities are also often sources of tremendous violence and disruption. But this window has been open to us in this moment where we can take a look, have some new perspective on those vulnerabilities. But we can also take stock of what we have at our disposal. So what have we learned? We've learned about the incredible human instinct to come together in times of challenge. We've learned that we have the creativity to problem solve. We've also learned that we have the resources to address the problem when we act like it's an emergency. And so with hundreds of other civil society groups across the country, we spent the last couple of months designing 6 principles for a just recovery, because we can't go back to business as usual after the COVID-19 pandemic. And I want to invite you all to take a look at this beautiful website that we used to launch these 6 principles that now over 450 civil society groups from every sector of Canadian civil society across the country have signed on to. You can take a look at the 6 principles here, and these are meant to be high-level principles that help galvanize the energy for a just recovery in Canada, and that also break down silos and make sure that we're all working hand in hand to build the future we need, because we're really standing on the threshold right now between the old world and the next, and it's up to us to make sure the new world is a world that we build together. So I'm going to just scroll through these beautiful images by an artist named Karina Keeling quickly, and then invite you all to take a look in more detail later on. And then I'm gonna close my screen sharing and start having a conversation with all of you, because I've seen a couple of questions in the chat already. Thanks, guys.
Thanks so much, Catherine. Can you hear me?
I can.
Good. I'll leave my video off. So you've seen a couple of questions, and maybe we could start with the one that Linda posed just a minute ago. As you know, we're very focused on sub-Saharan Africa. And so Linda's asking about any advice on messaging regarding international climate financing. We've seen that people are concerned about making sure there's enough money in Canada to achieve our climate goals. Do you have thoughts on the way that we can sort of position this? I really like some of your points earlier about people and community. But do you have any thoughts on international climate financing, particularly adaptation and mitigation in sub-Saharan Africa?
Yeah, sure thing. So at this point, if you ever hear a government again say that there's not enough money to do something, you can feel that you're able to just totally disregard that statement, in my opinion, because we have seen in the last few months the resources that governments are able to mobilize when that mobilization is required. And we have also seen the tremendous amounts of money that are locked in to private hands. So there has been some really significant research done, for instance, on the amounts of money that are being held in offshore tax havens that are working on behalf of Canadian companies, including many of them oil and gas companies. And so not until governments have completely eliminated fossil fuel subsidies, until the money hiding in those tax havens has been clawed back and put into Canadian tax coffers, will I accept any argument that there's not enough money for Canada to do its fair share of international climate financing globally. I did want to make the point that, because I know you do a lot of work in sub-Saharan Africa, that fairly consistently in the international climate world, we see the most ambition from the most vulnerable countries. And that is a source of incredible inspiration for me and also heartbreak. So for instance, 2020 was supposed to be the year of ambition. It was supposed to be the year when parties to the Paris Agreement came back to the table with new promises, more ambitious promises to close the gap in emissions that we know that exists to keep warming levels to more manageable levels to help avoid some of the most catastrophic impacts of climate change. Many countries will not actually deliver their new promise this year because 2020 has been such a roller coaster. But we have seen countries like Rwanda put new, more ambitious climate pledges on the table, even in the midst of trying to respond to a global pandemic using far fewer resources than a country like Canada has. And so the way I talk about this is in terms of fair share. And I'm going to quickly share this other image with you. So we released this graphic at the most recent UN climate negotiations. And when we talk about Canada's fair share of the global effort to confront climate change, we talk about it in light of science and equity. So we not only take a look at what Canada's carbon budget should be according to global carbon budgets as somewhat calculated by the IPCC, but we say Canada has a historic responsibility for the climate crisis, and as one of the 10 wealthiest nations in the world, the resources to take action. And so in this infographic, which is fairly easy to find on our website, we talk about Canada needing to increase its international climate financing to at least $4 billion per year in order to get closer to our fair share contribution of the global effort to address climate change. And we see that there's really this pairing of domestic as well as international action that Canada must take in order to deliver that fair share. So I think that's a worthwhile way of talking about it, and also calling upon the fact that that we're in this together, and Canadians do have a history of punching above our weight internationally. And being able to deliver some of those international solutions.
Thanks, Catherine. I think you can see a couple more questions, and maybe we'll let you take a run at those about the $4 billion to clean up abandoned oil wells. And then another question about the language that we use. We're talking about climate crisis and climate justice. So I'll let you answer those.
Mm-hmm. Great, thanks. So I'm just taking a quick look at the questions. Okay, so on the oil well cleanup, a number of organizations were kind of on watch for stimulus spending that would go to the fossil fuel industry, because there are many other jurisdictions where we've seen pretty reckless spending going to the fossil fuel industry. And we know that if we do that in a thoughtless way in Canada or around the world, we're going to be locking in emissions for decades to come. And so we were feeling quite concerned, and we wrote a letter to the government saying, hey, if you're going to bail out the oil and gas industry, you better make sure that you're doing that to protect workers and not to increase shareholders' profits or CEO profits like we saw in the 2008 financial crisis. So when that initial announcement was made that the amount of money that they will be sending Alberta's way to the oil patch is specifically this pot of money is specifically earmarked for employing oil and gas workers to clean up abandoned wells, and in making sure that companies meet their methane emissions reduction obligations. We celebrated that because we said, actually, this is like a step in the right direction for just transition. And it took a while for the government to make that decision. So I think they changed their mind, and it was good to see them being thoughtful. That being said, in the meantime, so since that announcement was made, millions more dollars have been funneled into Export Development Canada and Business Development Canada, while the transparency laws that govern EDC and BDC have been weakened. And we know that EDC and BDC already are one of the primary funders of the fossil fuel industry in Canada, at home and abroad. And so we are feeling quite worried about the amount of money that might be passed through those entities to fund the fossil fuel sector. So it's important for us all to play a watchdog role there. In terms of the language, man, like, you know, I would kind of say, like, use the language that works for you and the people who you talk to. So I think we in the climate community can get a little fetched up in using the right words, as if we find the exact right word, that's going to fix the problem. But that's not going to fix the problem. What's going to fix the problem is people who you trust, who reflect your values, who are part of your community, telling you that they care about something, and therefore it's okay for you to care about too. And that's why I think it's so powerful for groups like GRAND to be involved in this fight, because you have access to your communities, your families. You are people who other people trust, who a lot of other people trust. And being able to invite others into a conversation about climate change, no matter what language you're using, is so important. So I'm going to take Sue's question. Are there strategies that could happen in sub-Saharan Africa that would be beneficial to the rest of the world by capturing carbon or GHGs or producing green energy? So I'm so lucky to have many brilliant African colleagues, including one colleague, Mohammed, who has recently started an organization called Power Shift Africa. And I've learned so much from him about what can and needs to happen in the African continent. And a message of his that I've really taken to heart, and that I think bears out when we take a look here at home, is that it's not about what Africa can do for the world when it comes to climate action. It's about what climate action can do for Africa. And so we have this situation where, you know, systemic violence, colonialization, and imperialism has robbed many African countries of their resources and their political stability and autonomy. And so ideally, climate action will work so as to restore, create new opportunities for prosperity, restore some of that autonomy, restore some of that political stability. And a big part of how that might happen is through the building of renewable energy. And let me bring this to a parallel of the Canadian situation, where, you know, Indigenous communities in Canada have been forcibly removed from their traditional territories, have been also robbed of cultural and natural resources, and have been subject to the violent forces of colonialism and imperialism. And those communities, many of them, are now building renewable energy projects, and those renewable energy projects are bringing tremendous prosperity and also energy autonomy into their communities. So at this point in Canada, over 20% of renewable energy projects are owned by Indigenous communities, which is totally incredible. And I think is such a real source of strength and resilience building in those communities. So I think that's the way I would think about the opportunities that climate action presents for sub-Saharan Africa.
Thanks, Catherine. Could I just let you know, we did distribute the Just Recovery Principles, and we got so many good comments back from our members across the country and friends and family we shared them with. It's beautifully done. But a lot of us are concerned that once the pandemic's over, all of the Just Recovery talk and the principles will people will want to go back to business as usual.
Yeah.
Any thoughts on how we keep the momentum going?
Yeah, that's a great question and a good one to end on. And I always want to hear your thoughts as well. So please, like, put them in the chat if you have any ideas. It is, of course, in times of crisis and instability, really tempting to recede into the status quo, right? To just do what's familiar. And that's something that we are going to need to push very hard to make sure our governments avoid, because our governments, more than anyone, are going to want to double down on the status quo and to just recede into what's familiar, rather than taking advantage of this window that has been presented to us to do a 180. How we keep up that momentum. So, I mean, really, I think we're kind of in the midst of doing it. We have seen in the last few weeks people willing to risk their lives, their livelihoods, their health to demand justice, to demand safety for themselves, their loved ones, and their communities. And this, for me, harkens back very much to the kinds of demands that we've seen on the streets of people who are demanding climate action, on the small island developing states who are yelling out to the world that we will not be sacrificed to the climate crisis, that we are not going to die, we are going to live. And I think at this point, that's where we need to be willing to take this conversation, to say we're willing to put ourselves on the line to some extent, and we're willing to, you know, have uncomfortable conversations with our community members and with our workplaces and with our elected officials, and we're not going to stop having those uncomfortable conversations until we see the change that we need to see. So that's, I think, what I'm taking heart from, because all around the world right now, I'm seeing that people are no longer willing to accept a status quo that doesn't work for people or the planet. And we just need to keep that energy up. So whatever way you can do that, whatever way you can care for yourself so that energy stays alive in you, is what you need to do. And how you can cultivate that in others is perhaps something else to think about.
Thanks so much. There is one more question, but we will wrap it up because we do want to make sure we allow time for your photo of everyone. But Catherine, that was just excellent. Thank you so much.
Such a pleasure.
For taking the time. You know, I made note myself as you went along of, you know, this is even things like the wonderful phrase of an act of love is what climate action is all about. It's something that we can, I think, really work with, as well as a lot of other advice and ideas you had for us. So can I hand it to you, Janet? I see you there. Should we turn everybody on for a photo, or?
Yes, what we're going to do is ask you, those of you that can turn your video back on, please do so. Some I will have to do for you. Go to gallery view, so we will try and get a photo of as many people.
Oh, it's so great to see you all.
As possible.
Here we are.
Hello, everyone.
I'm just trying to see. Some of you I turned off, so you need to be asked to turn your video back on.
Wow, what an amazing group of people.
Yes, I agree with you. We are.
I'm just going through and taking so many pictures, everyone.
Okay.
Sorry, I'm just trying to get some of you back on.
So there's Joan, Gail.
Yeah, it's okay. Start video. There's a lot of you. Okay. Anybody else? Oh, okay, here we go.
Thanks, Janet. Thanks for your excellent technical wrangling.
Okay, we'll try and, maybe this is as good as it's going to get here as I try and find Gail. Where's Gail?
The problem is that I shared my link with a friend and she's used it. So I'm actually
okay.
on, but
There's
my
two
friend,
Gails.
I'm not sure what she's doing.
Okay.
It's so nice to see everyone. I haven't seen people for a long time.
Oh, there we
Yeah, I think that's a nice point.
I'm back. Where have I been?
All right.
Okay.
Janet, did you want to add a word of thanks before we sign
Absolutely.
off?
Thank you. Well, thank you to all of you. And here I'm still looking at my list for joining us, for the great response. I think we'll have to do this again. And as we learn how to use the technology, I think we'll just get better and better. Have to say that Catherine was sort of our technical advisor on this. So thank you all for joining. This is our last group grand meeting before we break for the summer. We will reconvene by our usual method in September. But stay tuned. We will be communicating with you throughout the summer as our campaigns, and this one in particular, continue to rev up.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks,
And we will,
everybody.
yeah, thank you,
Okay,
Catherine.
and
Thanks
let
so
me
much.
very quickly say before everybody goes, because my name wasn't attached to it, don't believe what you hear about old dogs not learning new tricks. All it is it takes us a little bit longer.
Here's to that.
Okay. Thanks,
Bye-bye.
everyone.
Everybody.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.